Although HMP The Verne was described as generally safe and respectful, the 2024 inspection exposes a dangerously hollow institution where the state appears to have surrendered any meaningful ambition of rehabilitating some of the country's most high-risk prisoners. The entire model of The Verne is built on the premise that men convicted of sexual offences, a population many would argue represents some of the most difficult and dangerous offenders in the system, should be challenged, trained, and supported to change their behaviour so they are less of a threat when released. Yet the report reveals there were literally no accredited offending behaviour programmes running at all during the inspection, despite housing over 600 prisoners, many of them elderly, unwell, and still high risk. Years of their lives have passed behind bars with nothing to meaningfully shift their attitudes or distorted thinking, which amounts to a staggering abdication of public protection. It is borderline scandalous to imagine these men quietly serving their time, biding their release dates without any treatment or evidence-based interventions, and then being unleashed back into the community with the same risk profile they had on sentencing, if not worse. The inspector rightly points out the fundamental flaw in this so-called training prison. If it does not actually train people out of sexual offending, what is the point of its existence? The governor and senior staff knew the offending behaviour provision was missing and pleaded for funding, but the system prioritised a substance-free living unit, despite acknowledging there was no serious drug problem. It is hard to escape the sense that there was willful neglect of the core function because sexual offending is politically toxic, and the prison service was happier to be seen tackling drugs, an easier public narrative, even if the needs of this prison population were vastly different. In a further disturbing twist, the report says only 2% of staff had completed the online training on working with people convicted of sexual offences in the previous year, and many frontline officers outright said they did not want to know what crimes the men had committed for fear of bias. In a Category C prison where staff are supposed to monitor risk and spot so-called offence-mirroring behaviours, this is beyond astonishing. You cannot manage risk you are unwilling to see, and you cannot challenge someone's sexual thinking if you refuse to learn what their offending was in the first place. It sets up an environment where dangerous patterns go unnoticed, prisoners are free to act out subtle precursors to their crimes, and staff are essentially working blind. This is not professionalism. It is a dereliction of duty, made worse by a system that does not even hold them to proper mandatory specialist training. The inspector's tone is almost incredulous that, even with a relatively stable staff group, they were so underprepared and disengaged in dealing with a uniquely challenging population, one that the public rightly expects to be managed with a forensic level of skill and oversight. Prisoners, meanwhile, are left bored and underemployed, locked in a stagnant environment described as lacking adequate education, with a curriculum that fails to match their needs, no sense of purpose, and too few opportunities to gain skills. The prison's own definition of full-time work was so far removed from any external understanding of the term that the inspector essentially described it as a nonsense. When you add that to regime curtailments driven by repeated staff shortages and medical escorts, it means that men who should be actively rehabilitating are instead left idle, growing older, more institutionalized, more resentful, and more socially disconnected, a time bomb for recidivism. It is all framed as a calm environment, but it is a calm built on inactivity, not progress. The report highlights how over half the population is over 50, many of them frail, suffering dementia or complex health conditions. The Dorset unit was praised for its palliative and social care, but the rest of the healthcare situation is dire, with unsafe outpatient facilities and cancelled GP access because of emergencies. Officers were taking dementia sufferers to adjudications for assault, which the inspectors noted was plainly inappropriate and borderline cruel. There was a chilling description of 2 constant supervision cells, gated cells in segregation, being used for prisoners in crisis, an arrangement that feels almost medieval. There is no credible plan for a safe medical centre despite years of knowing that the current healthcare is inadequate. The care of older, dying prisoners was, ironically, the best developed part of the prison. Yet the actual rehabilitative work that could stop future victims was left in tatters. The prison's leadership was described as visible, approachable, even innovative in some areas, but the evidence shows they have failed to deliver their fundamental mission. Inspectors slammed the regional prison service for providing no meaningful challenge, not demanding accountability, and failing to share lessons from other sites. There were serious shortfalls in data use. The leadership did not even understand properly why violence and self-harm were rising. There had been no strategic analysis of self-harm, despite a 28% increase since the last inspection, and not a single investigation into the 17 prisoners taken to outside hospitals after serious self-harm. This is a shocking gap, given the potential for repeated patterns of harm or even death. The oversight of use of force was equally sloppy. For 4 months, no scrutiny meetings took place even as incidents rose sharply. The inspectors watched body cam footage of staff using force improperly on mentally unwell or self-harming prisoners, sometimes with no de-escalation and no proper follow-up to learn from those incidents. If that is what passes for reasonable safety in a modern prison, then there is a fundamental crisis in standards. The Verne, then, sits as a monument to the deep contradictions in the English prison system. On the one hand, a stable, low-drug environment with a friendly staff culture, relatively low physical violence, and some pockets of good social care for the elderly. On the other hand, a catastrophic failure to deliver its core mission of challenging, treating, and rehabilitating men whose crimes society fears the most. If you believe prisons exist to protect the public, then HMP The Verne is not protecting the public. It is simply warehousing men until they are released, with no serious reduction in risk. And that is the most controversial conclusion. Despite its glossy language about purposeful activity and a community ethos, the prison is arguably a public safety hazard. When a prison for convicted sex offenders becomes little more than a semi-open retirement home, with no treatment, no evidence-based risk management, and no staff competence in offence-focused practice, the public should be outraged. There is a grim complacency in tolerating such an arrangement. Worse still, the inspector hints that some men have been released from the Verne without even the basic interventions that parole panels would usually expect, a breathtaking failure of both the prison and the probation service. It is the kind of systemic neglect that leaves victims and survivors of sexual offences rightly furious. What confidence can the public possibly have when the state, knowing the risks, knowingly fails to intervene? What faith should victims have that lessons are being learned? A population dominated by older men, including those on indefinite sentences, still deserves the chance for change, because the alternative is simply unleashing their risk back into society after decades of stagnation. That is not justice. That is a dangerous illusion of containment, easily shattered the moment one of these men offends again. It is easy to call the Verne peaceful. It is easy to praise a safe regime, but that is a dangerous illusion if the deeper reality is that this place is not fulfilling its duty to reduce risk. The public deserves to know the truth. A prison like this, coasting along, is every bit as dangerous as one in open crisis. No rehabilitation means no protection, and no protection means more victims. In that sense, HMP The Verne represents one of the greatest scandals of all. A prison that no longer even pretends to do what it was built to do. Of course, here's the revised version with rape replaced by sexual assault, which is still accurate but slightly less stark in tone. Maoist cult leader who held daughter captive for 30 years locked up with Gary Glitter in luxury prison, dubbed Pedo Alcatraz. Aravindan Balakrishnan, the notorious Maoist cult leader who kept his own daughter in prison for 3 decades, is serving his sentence in a so-called luxury prison alongside convicted paedophile Gary Glitter. Balakrishnan, 80, known to his followers as Comrade Bala, is housed at HMP The Verne, a remote Category C prison on the Isle of Portland in Dorset. The prison, which underwent a £3.3 million refurbishment in 2018, accommodates 580 sex offenders. During his reign of terror, Balakrishnan sexually assaulted female cult members and subjected his daughter, Katie Morgan Davies, to relentless psychological and physical abuse, keeping her virtually isolated from the outside world until she escaped in 2013. He was convicted in 2016 of multiple offences, including 4 counts of sexual assault, 6 counts of indecent assault, 2 counts of actual bodily harm, cruelty to a child under 16, and false imprisonment, and was handed a 23-year prison sentence. Despite the horrific conditions he imposed on his victims, including beating them, forbidding friendships, and restricting them to reading only Maoist literature, Balakrishnan now resides in conditions that have been described as relatively comfortable. Inside HMP The Verne, prisoners have access to a football pitch, a koi carp pond, a gym, a farm area where they can tend ducks and plants, and even a giant outdoor chess set. Each of its 6 accommodation units features common rooms, dining areas, and 20-inch flat-screen TVs. There is also a library stocked with newspapers, books, and magazines. A source commented, "Balakrishnan is in the general population with other prisoners. The idea that he is enjoying any kind of luxury will be appalling for his victims to hear." For Katie Morgan Davies, who waived her right to anonymity to expose the horrific abuse she endured, Balakrishnan's privileged prison environment is a stark contrast to the caged bird with clipped wings existence he forced upon her. During the trial, jurors heard how she was beaten for singing nursery rhymes, banned from making friends, and indoctrinated with communist dogma. She did not know until adulthood that Balakrishnan was her biological father and that fellow cult member Sian Davies was her mother. Davies died in 1996 after falling from a bathroom window in the group's Brixton house. Other members of Balakrishnan's Workers' Institute of Marxism-Leninism Mao Zedong thought cult included Josephine Heriville, daughter of Bletchley Park codebreaker John Heriville, and a Malaysian student. The group was finally freed after a charity received a tip-off from a desperate phone call. In a chilling revelation, Balakrishnan claimed to possess a supernatural force named Jackie, supposedly capable of unleashing disasters around the world if cult members disobeyed him. He derived the name from the initials of Jehovah, Allah, Christ, Krishna, and immortal Eswaran. His beliefs were steeped in extremist politics. Describing himself as a revolutionary socialist, Balakrishnan idolized leaders such as Mao Zedong, Stalin, Pol Pot, and Saddam Hussein, even wishing aloud that the death toll at Tiananmen Square had been higher than 3,000. During sentencing, Judge Deborah Taylor described his behavior as ruthless and highlighted how he had created a climate of fear, jealousy, and control among his followers. Your treatment of your daughter from her birth to the age of 26 was a catalogue of mental and physical abuse. You engendered a climate of fear, jealousy, and competition for your approval. You have shown no remorse whatsoever. Balakrishnan's convictions guarantee he will remain behind bars until well into his 90s, even if released halfway through his 23-year term, with additional license conditions to follow. A prison service spokesperson responded to criticism of the Verne's facilities, stating, "Like all closed prisons, offenders are subject to strict security measures." Despite that, the relative comfort of HMP The Verne, known by some as Paedo Alcatraz for its high-profile sex offender population, remains a bitter irony for those who survived Balakrishnan's cult of cruelty. A female prison officer who embarked on a forbidden and obsessive relationship with a convicted sex offender has been spared prison after she was caught attempting to smuggle a syringe into a jail in order to inseminate herself with the inmate's sperm. Cherry-Ann Austin Saddington, 29, from Weymouth, developed an intense relationship with Bradley Trengrove, a prisoner serving a 13-year sentence for rape and sexual activity with a child. She worked as a warden at HMP The Verne on the Isle of Portland, Dorset, where the pair began their illicit affair. Miss Austin Saddington, a mother of 3, started working at The Verne in July 2019. The court heard that even during her probation period, suspicions were raised about her inappropriate contact with prisoners. leading to the extension of her probation. In January 2022, Mr. Trengrove, then 26, was transferred to the Verne from another prison. By August, he and Miss Austin Saddington had initiated a secret relationship, breaking all rules of professionalism and security within the prison service. Over a 6-month period, the officer and inmate engaged in sexual activity up to 40 times, prosecutors said. The pair often used prison workshops to meet, exploiting times when staff oversight was minimal. Miss Austin Saddington would even come into the prison on her days off to continue the affair. Robert Bryan, prosecuting, read to Bournemouth Crown Court a series of messages that revealed the depth of Miss Austin Saddington's infatuation with Mr. Trengrove. In these messages, she called him the one, her reason for living, and vowed to love him till my last breath. She even saved his number in her personal phone under the name husband-to-be, a clear sign of her plans to maintain the relationship beyond the prison walls. In November 2022, Miss Austin Saddington told Mr. Trengrove she was pregnant, but sadly lost the baby around 8 weeks later. Determined to have a child with him despite the separation, she hatched a bizarre and dangerous plan. In March 2023, Mr. Trengrove was moved to HMP Channings Wood in Devon, a move that might have ended their relationship. However, Miss Austin Saddington attempted to maintain contact, even trying to send him explicit photos, which were intercepted by prison staff. On May 26, 2023, she visited Mr. Trengrove under a false name, determined to collect his sperm for artificial insemination. Officers conducting a routine search found she was not wearing underwear and had concealed an empty Calpol syringe inside her bra. According to the prosecution, Mr. Trengrove had wrapped the sperm in cling film to hand over to her. She was arrested shortly after. In addition to smuggling the syringe, Miss Austin Saddington admitted sneaking a mobile phone into prison for Mr. Trengrove's use, a serious security breach, especially as it allowed him to communicate without monitoring. Mr. Trengrove, meanwhile, admitted his role in encouraging Miss Austin Saddington's misconduct, as well as possessing the illegal phone and using it to transmit unauthorized images and sound from inside prison. He was handed an extra 2 years and 3 months on top of his existing 13-year sentence. During sentencing, Emily Cook, defending Miss Austin Saddington, argued passionately on her client's behalf. She described Miss Austin Saddington as ashamed and devastated by her own actions, noting the woman had suffered a serious fall after the affair was uncovered, which left her permanently wheelchair-bound. Miss Cook told the court, "You are not sentencing the woman who committed these offences. She is a very different woman now." Judge Jonathan Fuller, KC, described Miss Austin Saddington's behaviour as a gross breach of trust that had undermined the integrity and safety of the prison. However, he acknowledged her life-changing injuries and accepted they made immediate custody inappropriate. Had it not been for the accident that befell Miss Austin Saddington, the sentence would have been an immediate sentence of imprisonment, the judge said. Miss Austin Saddington was instead handed a 2-year suspended sentence for misconduct in a public office. The case has reignited debate about the safeguarding of prison staff, relationships with inmates, and the extent of supervision required to prevent such gross misconduct. A prison service spokesperson told reporters, "Staff working in our prisons are expected to uphold the highest standards of professionalism. Misconduct of this kind is absolutely unacceptable and undermines the trust the public places in the service. Robust security and vetting measures are in place to protect the public, and any staff found breaking the rules will be investigated and prosecuted where appropriate." Prison experts say inappropriate relationships between staff and inmates remain a persistent risk, driven by manipulation, coercion, and at times, genuine infatuation. Prison service data shows that dozens of officers have been dismissed or prosecuted in recent years for affairs with prisoners, despite extensive training and warnings. Mr. Trengrove's sexual offences included a violent rape and an offence involving sexual activity with a minor, making Miss Austin Saddington's actions even more alarming to the public and her former colleagues. The court heard that Miss Austin Saddington who was a trusted officer on the prison wings, had been trained to deal with precisely these kinds of manipulative offenders, but instead fell under Mr. Trengrove's spell. In a victim impact statement read to the court, Mr. Trengrove's original victim described feeling sickened to hear about the prison officer's involvement with the man who had sexually assaulted her, saying it brought back deep trauma. Prison governors are now understood to be reviewing security protocols at HMP The Verne and HMP Channings Wood to ensure more rigorous monitoring of staff-prisoner interactions in future. Meanwhile, Miss Austin Saddington, whose dreams of a family with an inmate ended in public disgrace, is attempting to rebuild her life while under the shadow of a suspended prison term and permanent disability.